Russell Moore, the new president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, is famous for saying, we're no longer the moral majority, we're now the prophetic minority. And that means we have to have a change in how we understand our cultural situation in the United States. For Catholics, it's a little bit easier because, we were always kind of a suspicious religious entity until JFK, but at that point we had ceased being a distinctive religious entity. And now that we're distinctive, kind of like a JP2 generation form, we're being suspicious again. But for many mainline Protestants and evangelicals, being fully American and being fully Christian were never in tension. Right? You could be fully American and fully Lutheran or fully Episcopalian or fully Presbyterian, and those things would never conflict. And what Dr. Moore's insight is, they're starting to conflict, and no one's going to be able to avoid it. So what do we do as religious leaders? What do you do? I'm not a religious leader. So what do you do as religious leaders to prepare your congregations for this new cultural reality? There's not going to be an easy confluence, an easy fit between your Christian beliefs and now popular American values. So what do you do if you're the principal of a local school and you run into one of these conflicts, the transgender student? What do you do if you're the baker who gets asked to make a same-sex wedding? What do you do if you're the director of an adoption agency and a same-sex couple comes in? Because what I've noticed is that a lot of the way that these cases get sorted out in public opinion and the media depends on how the individual behaved. So it's not so much what they did as how they did it. Do they come across in a loving, Christ-like way in their interactions with whatever caused the situation in their discussions with the media, or do they come across as the Westboro Baptist Church? That's going to create a huge difference in how these situations are evaluated. And so whatever you can do to help prepare people for how to navigate these challenges will help provide better outcomes. The fourth things for churches to do is to put this within a larger narrative. Realize our historical moment. I started by saying, compare it to the pro-life movement and think about the successes that they've made within 42 years. I want to put this within a 2,000-year framework of the Christian church. In terms of heresy arising, which then gives need for the orthodox response. All of the creeds that we have, all the doctrinal statements, were in response to a heretical challenge. So someone proposes a bad idea, they formulate a response, and then it gets formalized within a creedal statement. The Nicene Creed is largely a response to various heresies about Christology and Trinitarian theology. And so for the early church, if we put this in that sort of a big picture, the challenges that Augustine and Athanasius and the Council of Chalcedon, Council of Nicaea, what they're all responding to is, what is orthodoxy when it comes to Christology and Trinitarian theology? What's the nature of God? Those were the debates that were raging in 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Christianity. If you then and as a result, we get very rich reflections on those questions, right? So the challenge of heresy is what then provides much richer theological understandings on orthodoxy. We wouldn't have some of Athanasius' writings and some of Augustine's writings if it wasn't for Nestorius and Arius and other heretics. Fast forward 1,000 years to the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and since this is a mixed audience, regardless of where you come down, I've left my Luther pin on the table there. Regardless of where you come down, I think everyone could agree that as a whole, we got richer reflections on orthodoxy as a result of the challenge. So those debates largely focused on the nature of salvation, soteriology, and ecclesiology, the nature of the church. And regardless of who you think the heretic is and who you think the orthodox position is, everyone came out with a richer understanding of these issues. That by forcing the question, it forced people to reflect and think more deeply. And hopefully, those institutional divides will one day be healed, and Christ's prayer in the garden that we would all be one would come to fruition. But that's going to be taking work, and part of that work will be sounder reflections on the nature of salvation, the nature of the church. Think about today's debates. Today's debates, I want to argue, all center on anthropology. They're not about the nature of God. They're not about the nature of the church. They're about the nature of man. I take this insight from John Paul II. When John Paul was a bishop in Poland, and he then went to the Second Vatican Council as a bishop, his kind of diagnosis of what has gone wrong in the 20th century. We have 2 world wars, a Holocaust, 3 totalitarian regimes, the work camps, the Gulag. He says all of these things are about a misplaced understanding of the nature of man. They're based on faulty anthropology. The world wars, the totalitarian regime, it viewed man as a cog in the wheel of the state. What the result of socialism, Marxism, the various kind of totalitarian forms of government was to say that the state is what matters and man is simply an instrument at the service of the state. And so one of the criticisms that John Paul raises against communism and socialism is that it has eclipsed a true understanding of man. He then extended that analysis in the encyclical he wrote on the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. And so he said that the abortion Holocaust was also about a misunderstanding of the nature of man. I would say that whether it's abortion or embryo-destructive research or cloning or the same-sex marriage debate or the transgender issues that we now confront, they all spring from a faulty anthropology. And so to put this in that larger historical context is simply to say that when a challenge of heresy comes, the end result is richer reflections on orthodoxy. And that the challenge for the church in our generation is both philosophical and theological, richer reflections on the truth about human nature. That we're made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we all have innate and intrinsic worth. That we're created male and female, and that our sex nature, male and female, masculine and feminine, should be embraced, not discarded or changed. That male and female are created for each other in the bond of marriage. Those are the 3 truths that are being rejected in our era. We're not having debates about Trinitarian theology. We're not having debates about faith and works and salvation. Those debates obviously continue, but they're not at the forefront of what's going on right now. At the forefront of what's going on in these debates about the human person. And so one thing that I would suggest is that for the people within your congregations who are intellectually inclined, that's something to suggest that they set themselves on in terms of their own study, their own scholarship. Maybe the next Augustine is in one of your congregations. And when he writes the book De Trinitate, it's a great reflection on the Trinitarian nature of God. Maybe someone in your congregation is going to write that sort of book about the nature of man. What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God, to be created male and female? To have better understandings of that, both philosophical and theological. So then let me close with the 5th thing for the church. And then we'll go to your questions. And that is that we simply have to live it out, right? So everything I've said up until now has just kind of been window dressing or kind of preparatory for where the rubber hits the road, which is actually living out the truth. Pope Benedict is famous for saying, it's not the arguments of the intellectuals, it's the lives of the saints that wins converts. And it's remarkable for Benedict to say this, because Benedict is a first-class intellectual. Benedict's probably one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. He's one of the greatest European intellectuals of his generation. He and Habermas have this fascinating exchange, and someone like Habermas, who's probably the leading European intellectual, would have an exchange with Ratzinger, was precisely because he recognized the depths of Ratzinger Benedict's learning and knowledge and wisdom, even though he disagrees with him. And yet what Benedict's suggesting here is that it's not the arguments that you would find in Calvin's Institutes or Aquinas' Summa. It's an encounter with holiness that is most likely to have someone convert and believe the gospel. Yeah. And that what's taken place with Justice Kennedy's ability to redefine marriage is that for 50 years, we didn't live out the truth about marriage. And if we discarded monogamy and exclusivity and permanency, if we embraced the hookup culture and non-marital childbearing and high rates of cohabitation and divorce, it's not surprising that other people shrug their shoulders and say, why does the male-female thing matter? And so the long-term solution here is simply, what can we do to have more people live out faithful, happy, joyful, holy marriages? You know, what can we do so that more people are simply embodying the type of philosophy that we've talked about all day? Because most people aren't going to be converted on this issue by reading my book. It's going to be by someone who understood my book and then lived it out, and then someone comes in contact with that person. Because that's how you're going to evangelize. Someone who reads C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, lives it out, and then someone comes in contact with that person. I mean, that's how these things tend to happen. So all the preaching that you guys do, the ministry resources, the apologetics, that's equipping your congregations to be saints. So that other people who are never going to hear you preach, because they don't go to your church, when they come into contact with one of your congregants, that's going to be what evangelizes them. And that's just, I mean, again, the limitations of being a public policy, political philosopher person is, I don't know what to tell you to do to help you prepare your congregations to live out the truth about marriage. And hopefully this network can, you can trade secrets of the trade, in a certain sense, share secrets of the trade of what is effective, what sort of pre-Cana programs, that's the jargon of the Catholic Church. So what sort of marriage preparation programs? What can you do to help people who just got engaged, regardless of where they are kind of with their own personal prayer life and their own holiness? Now that they've gotten engaged and they've come to you and they've asked you to do the wedding, what can you do to help get them on a better road? What can you do for your high school students? What can you do for your college students? What can you do for the youth groups to prepare people for marriage? What can you do for people who come to you in challenges in their marriages? What can you do to help people who otherwise might get divorced from not choosing to get divorced, to work through their struggles and find that they can actually, with the grace of God, live out their marriage vows? I don't know what the answer to that is. That's the question that needs answering. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we have some time for your other questions. Yeah, you've been first each time because you're right in front of me. So perfect.
Would you care to comment on what the Kentucky governor-elect said beyond what you just revealed to us?
I don't know what else he said, so that's all I know. What else did he say?
He went on to suggest the idea that marriage licenses be downloadable.
Oh, yes, so I forget.
People just get the marriage license and they file it, and they take people completely out of the...
I forget which state had already done that. I didn't know that he had embraced that idea, but I think...
Well, he proposed it. I'm not sure whether he embraced it or not.
He proposed it.
The article was a little foggy on that.
I mean, so what's interesting for me is that, I had to go to the DMV to register my car when I moved to DC. But every year I get to renew it online. So the question is, what is it that would make getting a marriage license something that couldn't be done with an automated process? If there's a way of avoiding these conflicts of conscience, shouldn't we seek them out? I think you need something to verify that the spouses say they are who they are, that they're above a certain age, that they're engaged in voluntary consent. But it strikes me that you could do that without having the clerk's name on the license itself. And I think that those, regardless of what the proper answer is, just the willingness to seek out those sorts of solutions strikes me as the right disposition to have. And there was an unwillingness to seek out those sorts of solutions by the previous administration. I think that's what spoke.
No, that's real clear.
Yeah. Yeah, right next to you.
What are your thoughts about churches simply removing themselves from being involved in the state-sponsored aspect of marriage, just doing the religious ceremony, you take care of the state part yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you should only consider doing that if the state starts forcing you to do something that would violate your beliefs about marriage. But that up until and unless it does that, I wouldn't give up the public role that you as a pastor have always played throughout the history of the United States. I mean, so one of the things, by allowing not just judges, but also ministers to preside over both the sacred and the secular part of marriage, was that the state was recognizing an aspect of your authority and that the marital relationship is one and the same. And so I wouldn't want Christians to prematurely cede that space in the public square. And I think that the cultural message that it would send could actually be one of backfiring, right? That, well, actually, so we should be privatizing our witness and not publicly engaging. So I would just be careful with the symbolism of it. Yep.
What do you think of Alabama's attempt to get the state out of marriage altogether?
I just don't think it'll work. So think about it this way. Your priest or your pastor can marry you, but they can't divorce you. They can't enforce alimony payments. They can't do a paternity test. They can't enforce child support payments. They can't settle a custody dispute. The reason that government got in the marriage business in the first place is that marriage is both a public and a private institution. It's both sacred and secular. It's both natural and supernatural. And so saying just get the state out of the marriage business wouldn't leave an answer of any of the questions that the state was originally trying to accomplish by having a marital institution in the first place. And it's much better if the state can get people married and stay married, then they don't have to adjudicate each and every one of those questions on an ad hoc basis, one by one, should marriages fail to form or fall apart. So if we know what the consequences are when marriages fail to form or they fall apart, imagine what the consequences would be if there were just never a marriage licensing scheme in the first place. You would actually just be inserting judges to make all these decisions on a one by one basis that much more. Yeah, right behind you, and then behind you. Yep.
You've had a lot of interaction and a lot of antagonism. You've experienced a lot of antagonism. You've been in hostile environments. And it seems to me that one of my weaknesses, and for those who hold our position, it'd be easy to become angry. And yet I've never seen you become angry and lose. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit of your experience about being winsome and how you make the case.
Clear alcohol. If you assume this is filled with, this was pure vodka. And now I actually don't know, there probably are a variety of opinions on alcohol consumption in the audience. The audience. No, I mean, partly it's realizing what it is that you've gotten yourself into. Right? I mean, so it's easy to get angry if you're expecting a level playing field and if you're expecting equal treatment. But you're not going to get angry if you go in knowing that this is going to be the deck is stacked against you, the referees are playing for the other team, and that's just the hand you've been dealt. So like the Piers Morgan interview, I didn't know I would be seated in the audience until I arrived there. I did know that it would be Piers and Susie Orman. But I didn't know the seating arrangement. But I knew going in, just in general, it's a CNN interview. Piers Morgan is a rather obnoxious liberal guy. Like, that's how it's his show, right? So he's paying for the microphone. So he gets to talk over me. I don't get to talk over him. He gets to decide who gets the last word. He gets all of that. So you go in realizing that that's the situation in which we find ourselves. So you can't get upset about it. I mean, there's something about like if you accept reality as reality is, it's hard to, nothing you can do to change it, right? All you can do is make the best of it. So I think partly it's just kind of being realistic about what's the nature of the enterprise you're engaged in. Partly it's there but for the grace of God go I attitude. So especially when I'm speaking on college campuses, I get, last night, Sean was there, the sorts of questions that I get are the, when did you stop beating your wife style questions, right? And they're trying to trap you, and they're being rather like, sometimes there's an air of arrogance that, they know better than you, and just remember that, wait, I was once that hot-headed college student, and if I hadn't had the proper influences in my life, I would have been just as obnoxious and aggressive, but on the left side of these issues. And can you blame college students if they've never had a high school teacher or a college student who presented the other side of the issue? Right? It's not their fault that everything that they see in newspapers, they don't read newspapers, everything they see on the Daily Show, when they watch the Colbert Report, everything they were taught in their high school civics class, everything that they've been taught in college is one-sided, that's what they come to believe is true. It's not their fault. So it's partly I'm going to do the best I can given where you are to help you take the next step in the right direction. And it's not helpful if I lose my cool and get angry at you. Right? I mean, it just undercuts what I'm trying to achieve. And then partly it's biographical. So I grew up, I'm one of 5 boys. So the dinner table was like a Piers Morgan. And I'm number 4 of 5. So there's something about, this is just how we had conversations. I went to a very liberal Quaker school in Baltimore for 12 years, and then I went to Princeton. None of these places were particularly hospitable for my views. And so I always learned to kind of be like the outspoken dissenter in those educational situations. So, from the perspective of, when you think about looking back on the various experiences I've had, I can see how providentially God used all of those experiences. At the time, I had no idea, what's this all adding up to. Now I can see it's prepared me well for kind of what it is that I do in life right now. So I'm going to say it's that combination of, being reality grounded, of, this is the situation in which I've been placed. Realizing that the people who are frequently trying to trip you up aren't necessarily doing it out of some vindictive spirit. They just don't know any better. They really don't. And then having a unique biographical background in which I'm used to this sort of thing. This was my high school AP American government class. That's what it was like. Yeah.
This isn't so much a question as a quick statement. When you were sharing your recommendations for what the church's response needs to be, I had a hard time not jumping up and down and waving my arms. I work for an organization that represents family life ministry, and it's what we do. We want to help. So just want to let everybody know, please come see.
And that's really important, that there are groups who have recognized this need, and I think they're underutilized. So that's a resource for everyone in this room. There are people who have focused and specialized on thinking through these questions and how can we make their expertise more widely available to the everyday pastor. How can more people get plugged into the expertise that you and your organization have, and then get that to more everyday Christians. Yeah.
Dr. Anderson, earlier today you mentioned the IRS and the 501c3. Pastor Barton referred to those entangling contracts, and without getting into the jurisdictional matters of the IRS, what they do have jurisdiction over, what they don't. Would you mind addressing, does a church really need to be recognized as a corporation, or is the First Amendment adequate enough to operate as a church or ministry? So
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know whether you need to be recognized as a corporation, but you do need some form of legal form because you own property. Right? So your church building sits on a plot of land. Who is it that owns that plot of land? Who is it that owns that building? You do need, there's no way in which you can avoid interaction with the government. If you run a college, who is it that owns that land? Who is it that owns those dormitories? Who is it that owns those lecture halls? Are you paying taxes on that land and on those dormitories and on those lecture halls? How do you do a transition when one pastor leaves and another pastor arrives? Is there a board of elders that governs? I mean, the governing structure, all these things, they need some legal form. And so, the Catholic Church is a way in which they do it, where I think, if I understand correctly, the bishop is kind of the one who is responsible for each church. His name showed up, and then he gets to appoint the pastor of that church. And then when bishops change, the documents change. I don't know how other denominations, other ecclesial groups think about this. And partly it depends, are you a non-denominational church? Are you part of a larger denomination? But there's no way, I would have to say you need to talk with a good attorney to figure that out. And the only other thing I'll mention about nonprofit tax status is that there was a time in our history where Americans understood that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And the reason why we recognize religious institutions as tax exempt nonprofits was precisely to respect the separation of church and state. That one of the things that meant was that the state wouldn't be taxing the church or any of its properties or any of its institutions, precisely so the state didn't have the power to destroy. And I think that's something now you hear settlers saying, oh, this is a subsidy. This is the state subsidizing religious institutions. And I think historically, the American Founders said, no, this is the way in which we respect different areas of jurisdiction and authority, and that the authority and jurisdiction of the church is separate than that of the state, and that's why the state doesn't have the capacity or the power or the authority to tax it. We're going to go right behind him, and then we'll go right to you. Yeah.
My question is a little bit broader. In the last legislative session, we did attempt to pass a RFRA, and it died in the Senate. And I have been considering whether, because there are not necessarily all that many religious people in the legislature, whether a broader approach of from the First Amendment with freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from compelled speech, whether trying to put that in some, and I'm not asking your legal advice, but in some form might not be more doable. And I'm wondering if you just have any thoughts as far as the intertwined nature of the speech and religion, and whether that would work, if you see any particular challenges or problems with that approach.
Great question. So a couple of thoughts. One is that, the highest level, people protect the freedoms that they personally exercise, right? And so one of the reasons why you see libertarians are really on board with free speech cases, but they seem not to care about the religious freedom cases, is that many libertarians are not personally religious, but many libertarians speak. So as a result, they're much more concerned about economic freedom and freedom of speech than they are about the free exercise of religion. And it's just, it's part of human nature. It's not to criticize libertarians, to say we all care more about those liberties that we personally exercise. If you're not in the business world, you're like, oh, economic liberty, who cares? If you're a business person, actually I care, it matters, and I want the freedom to be able to run my business in my best judgment. And so it's easy to kind of diminish the liberties that you don't exercise while elevating the liberties that you do exercise. So that means a couple of things in this context. One, it means that insofar as America becomes more and more of a secular society, we can expect to see religious freedom less respected. That religious freedom will be better protected when there were more religious Americans who were exercising religious liberty and therefore were covetous of it. One of the things that Madison says is that, Americans will be jealous of their freedoms and will therefore fight to protect them. Well, what happens when they're no longer jealous of their freedoms and they don't care about them? It also means that you should form alliances whenever possible. So one of the ideas behind naming it the First Amendment Defense Act was that it involved both freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of press and free exercise of religion. That it protects all of these things for people who believe marriage is the man and woman. And that's important, right? I mean, so you do want to have a way in which you can make alliances with other people based upon the freedom that they might be more interested in protecting. The last thing I'll say is that you started your question by saying since the legislators tend to be, was it more secular or more liberal, not very religious, that's just a reminder that elections have consequences. There's also no reason why that has to remain the case in the future. And so It's a way of thinking, maybe someone in this room is going to run for office. Maybe people in this room would support candidates for office. I mean, I don't know. It all depends. I work in a C3, so I can't engage in kind of electoral stuff. So I don't know how that side of the divide works. It's just not what I do. But for people who do specialize in that, that's something to consider. We get the government that we deserve. And what can we do as citizens to deserve a better government? Yeah, right next door, because I know you have experience in these things.
Last year, and thankfully for many of my colleagues here in this room who helped me with the RFRA bill, I ran into a lot of discussion, a lot of emails, thousands of them, a lot of them proposing that they could smoke pot and start the first church of peyote, and I mean, you just go down the line. And I've already, about a month ago, put in the First Amendment Defense Act, which we'll try to run this coming year. The bright line rule, when you look at that, how do you go about debating and helping people understand that this is not so highly exclusive, we're only focusing in on the first portion of the First Amendment, that we are protecting overall freedom?
Yeah.
Because that's going to be one of the questions that I can already tell you in the tunnel there between two of the buildings where I got hit up by a reporter who the first thing out of their mouth was, so you're trying to make it where county clerks don't have to do such and such. And so I just would like to hear some of those better arguments that you heard and developed.
Yeah, great question. So I mean, one thing to say is that it all depends on how you specify, like how it applies to public employees, for example. So you could say that this means no one's tax status can be changed. So that's a very bright line rule. No private business can be penalized, right? So we're not talking about public employees, we're talking about the baker, the florist, the photographer. That no license could be withheld. So if you're a marriage counselor, you're not going to lose your counseling license. That no contract or grant with the government. So if you're a Catholic Charity Adoption Agency and the state of Wyoming contracts with you to take care of orphans, that won't be on the line. And then when it comes to public employees, you can decide how you want to specify that, right? So you could write it just like the North Carolina law. So you can specify that what's going to take place here is that every citizen will receive the legal documents to which they are legally eligible, but we're going to accommodate ahead of time, behind the scenes, as many public officials as possible. And then just talk about the long history of America in doing that. We have long history of accommodating pacifists who couldn't serve in the armed forces, accommodating pacifists who worked in the postal office who couldn't process draft cards. Kentucky itself has a protection for vegetarians and animal rights activists who couldn't issue hunting licenses. So they had a system of accommodating county clerks who couldn't issue hunting licenses, and they refused to create a similar accommodation for people who had the objection to marriage licenses. So I would just go through and actually, Heritage just recently published a paper by Mark Hall, where he's a professor at George Fox University. And the title of, is it a